welcome back to the Mike is Outside Research Review Series. Today's explainer is, well, it's unpacking a really fascinating 2026 study. We're looking at a deeply practical question. How do we actually measure our ability to live alongside large carnivores? You know, as our towns and cities keep expanding, this is a puzzle we absolutely have to solve. So we're going to look at the exact science of how to do just that.
Think about it. Before we zone a brand new neighborhood on the edge of town, or say before we cut a sprawling new mountain bike trail system into the woods, we really have to ask ourselves, how do we actually measure our capacity to live right next to predators? Now, for decades, we've totally understood the biological tension between human expansion and wildlife habitats. That part is well documented. But understanding the human side, figuring out the actual social capacity of a town to share space with a mountain lion or a black bear, man, that has been notoriously difficult to pin down with any real hard data.
And that brings us to a seriously groundbreaking study. It was published in the journal Conservation Biology in 2026 by Benjamin Hassameh and a large team of colleagues. They noticed a huge gap. Conservationists and city planners just didn't have a standardized, psychometrically validated tool. Basically, they were missing a reliable psychological ruler to measure how willing people actually are to coexist with predators. And without a standard ruler, it's practically impossible to compare different communities or even track if our coexistence strategies are, actually working. So, they went ahead and created a brand new framework to solve this exact problem.
They came up with the willingness to coexist, or WCoEx scale. I like to think of this as a highly calibrated social thermometer for town planners, recreation developers, and wildlife managers. It directly measures an individual's willingness to undertake an array of actions to accommodate the existence of carnivores right in the area where they live. And pay close attention to the phrasing there. It's not just about how people casually feel about animals. It's about what tangible actions they are actually willing to take.
Okay, let's dive right into our top 3 actionable takeaways, starting with takeaway 1, 2 coexistence dimensions.
So, it turns out human actions essentially fall into 2 very distinct buckets. First up, we have the individual domain. These are your personal, private sphere adaptations. Think of a local homeowner deciding to splurge on bear-proof trash cans, or a rancher taking the initiative to set up non-lethal livestock protection on their own property. Then, on the flip side, we have the collective domain. This represents broader public sphere actions. This is when that exact same person goes out and votes for conservation funding, or maybe steps up to the mic at a city council meeting to advocate for wildlife-friendly zoning.
Here's where it gets really cool. The researchers found a strong statistical correlation between those 2 domains. They call it the spillover effect. What this means on a purely practical level is that private actions actively encourage subsequent public support. It's like a domino effect. If a community planner can get a resident to just adopt coexistence methods in their own backyard, like, say, properly securing their compost, that individual actually becomes way more likely to support broader, carnivore-friendly public policies later on. You foster that individual behavior first, and it just naturally spills over into collective civic support.
Moving right along to takeaway 2, the 3 core beliefs. If we're going to build successful recreation plans, we really have to understand the cognitive engine running underneath all this community behavior. The study outlines 3 core levers, or basically foundational beliefs, that planners can evaluate to figure out why a community is, or maybe isn't, willing to coexist. Step 1 is perceived positive consequences. Do people actually see the benefits, like the ecological role of predators or the economic boost you get from ecotourism? Step 2 is perceived negative consequences. Basically, how high do they rate the risks, like threats to their pets, their livestock, or just personal safety? And finally, step 3 is ethical considerations. What moral responsibilities do humans feel toward wildlife, like the deep-seated belief that these animals simply have an intrinsic right to exist? Now, the crucial point the researchers make here is absolutely fascinating. Ethical considerations can influence our intentions completely independent of utilitarian cost-benefit assessments. Let that sink in for a second. A community's moral compass, their ethical belief about a wolf or a bear's right to exist, operates entirely separately from their logical, practical assessment of risks and rewards. You can totally have a community that acknowledges very high physical risks, but still overwhelmingly supports coexistence just because they feel a really strong ethical duty.
And that brings us to takeaway 3, a standardized measurement tool. Let's look at how rigorously this whole thing was tested out in the real world. The researchers didn't just test this in theory. They validated their WCoEx scales with incredibly robust sample sizes of real Colorado residents. And they looked at 3 completely different major predators. They surveyed over 400 people specifically about gray wolves, another 442 for mountain lions, and 433 for black bears.
Through some really rigorous psychological testing, they proved that this framework's reliability holds up consistently across different species. It's not a fluke, it provides a rock-solid foundation for applied everyday use.
Which brilliantly illustrates a major flaw in past conservation efforts. You see, historically, wildlife managers use terms like tolerance and acceptance interchangeably with coexistence. But guess what? They really aren't the same thing at all. Tolerance usually just implies a passive lack of action. You're just sort of enduring the wildlife. Acceptance is a passive willingness to just have them around. But true coexistence, that requires humans to go way beyond passive. It requires taking active, deliberate steps to accommodate living with wildlife. And this scale finally measures that active step.
All right, let's bring it all home with real-world community implementation. How do local governments, tourism boards, and recreation planners actually use these insights in their day-to-day workflows?
This framework is absolute gold for policymakers and planners. Because the scale separates beliefs into risk versus ethics, you can tailor your community interventions perfectly. Let's say you survey your town and find high ethical support but high perceived risk. Well, you don't need to waste your budget on more educational pamphlets about why bears are good for the forest. They already believe that. Instead, you need to direct your funding toward tangible risk mitigation, like subsidizing specialized fencing. Conversely, if your community shows low ethical support, then that is exactly where you should be funding educational programs that emphasize the ecological and cultural value of the animals. It's all about hitting the right target.
So to wrap up our workflow implementation, tourism boards and recreation planners can deploy this scale locally to baseline their community. You can literally track attitudinal changes over time, say surveying before and after a massive new trail system opens. You can design tailored interventions based on a town-specific belief structures. Remember to focus on fostering individual behavioral change first to trigger that awesome spillover effect into the public sphere. And ultimately, you can use this tool to accurately assess the true social viability of your projects long before you ever break ground.
I'll leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up today's explainer. As our populations inevitably expand deeper and deeper into shared landscapes, is your own community truly ready to take action? And perhaps more importantly, how would you personally score on the WCoEx scale today? Think about your own backyard, your own voting habits, and your own moral compass. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep bringing these vital research insights into your everyday planning.